Happy May the 4th be with you. It's my nerd world, and welcome to it. I'm your host, Jon Justice. This is a massive show this week in honor of May the 4th. I hope you are enjoying or have enjoyed your Star Wars holiday. Lots to get to on the show. We will dive into, of course, the passing of an icon and Peter Mayhew that took everybody, certainly took me by surprise this week. Along with that, we will talk a little May the 4th. We'll talk about the Star Wars saga, 3 acts within 3 trilogies that act like 3 acts. Thank you, girls with sabers. Also, the perfect double feature for May the 4th. At least it is for me. I'll tell you what it is. Recent Star Wars TV and future movie news. Before we get to listener feedback this week, there is a massive spoiler section for the show. I'll explain my policy when it comes to spoilers, and if you don't want to be too spoiled for the Rise of Skywalker, I will absolutely give you advance notice on the podcast, and I'll kind of tell you the level of spoilers and where I'll give the bigger warnings when they'll happen during the show. All right, so let's go ahead and get right to it. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. This week, it is brought to you by the science fiction and space opera novel Embark, written by me, Jon Justice. I have a special running this weekend. I've done a massive update at mynerdworld.net. I'll give you all the details a little bit later on in the show.
We've passed on all we know. 1,000 generations live in you now. But this is your fight. We'll always be with you. No one's ever really gone.
Disturbing. I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one. There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you. Just let it in.
You know, and I suddenly find myself getting emotional over starting the show this week with the passing of Peter Mayhew in a way that I honestly didn't expect heading into this week's show for this May the 4th. And there is a lot to be celebrating. And I think along with that comes the celebration of Peter Mayhew and the joy that he brought so many of us, and many of us for almost our entire lives, in his portrayal of Chewbacca. And I know why it's kind of getting to me right now. I mean, obviously I was shocked and sad when I heard the news, but considering, that I pour a bit of myself into every single show that we do, I shouldn't be all that surprised that in this moment where I'm going to address the passing of Peter Mayhew that I would get emotional over it. But the other day, on I guess it was Thursday, I was heading back from a late in the day radio staff event, and news came across Twitter that Peter Mayhew had passed away. I personally was unaware that he was dealing with any major health issues beyond some of the more known things, especially with Jonas Suotomo taking over as the character almost completely, that he just had a hard time with his legs and had some surgery, and subsequently found out, and I guess maybe I knew this but didn't really think about it, that Peter Mayhew, given his stature, that individuals that are as tall as he is, right? He lived further than most individuals who are that tall, and I think a lot of it has to do with issues as it relates to the heart. and the body carrying around that type of weight. Certainly when it comes to heart issues, that gets right. That cuts right to the core of me with my multiple open heart surgeries and valve replacement and graft replacement and all that took place several years ago. But I was really taken by surprise in the passing of this individual, and I'd like to think that it was a nice thing, that trying to look at it in a positive way. Right. As Yoda would say, more them do not, miss them do not, those that transfer, that transform into the Force. But considering that I'm recording this show and releasing this show on this May 4th, May the 4th be with you, Star Wars Day celebration. Even in California, they've declared it a state holiday. I think a lot of that has to do with Galaxy's Edge, that his passing would occur so close to that. And it's providing a really fantastic opportunity to celebrate Peter Mayhew's life within the fandom while we celebrate Star Wars, and just such an iconic character. The thing that fascinated me the most in learning about Jonas Suotomo taking over the role was watching the documentaries and how Peter Mayhew taught Jonas how to be Chewbacca based off of Peter Mayhew's own mannerisms that he just automatically presented with the character. Having to walk a little bow-legged and little head twitches that Peter would do in portraying Chewbacca. The one thing that I thought was most interesting, and once you see it, you kind of can't unsee it, was Peter Mayhew told Jonas that when he is in the Falcon, or when he's doing something mechanical, but especially when he's in the Falcon and he's flying the Falcon, to almost slap at the controls. And if you watch Chewbacca in any of the films where Peter Mayhew is portraying him, and now Jonas is, you'll see what he's talking about. There's this way in which Chewbacca would sort of slam at the controls, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that his hands are furry, so he has to almost exaggerate his flipping of switches and pressing of buttons in order to create that effect, or else you just wouldn't be able to see his Chewbacca fingers hitting the button, so he would slap them. And I remember watching a documentary, and I think it might have been it was either obviously Force Awakens or The Last Jedi, where Jonas was talking about this, about how Peter had taught him this. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, and then we'll move on to the core of the show this week. The other thing I wanted to mention, too, that was I never had the privilege of meeting Peter Mayhew, unfortunately. But immediately after his passing and going on social networking, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, it was so amazing to see the number of individuals that had photographs taken with Peter and how accessible he had made himself to the fans. And just what an absolute sweetheart the man was. And I mean from well-known individuals to just acquaintances that I know through social networking or through the podcast or through my full-time radio show, who had the opportunity to meet him. And as a matter of fact, I was listening to the Star Wars Underworld podcast as I was preparing for the show today, and even hearing one of the hosts on that show talk about how he had met him so many times is at the point where he had an opportunity to meet him again, and he didn't. And this isn't a bad thing. It just tells you how accessible Peter Mayhew made himself. He didn't go and meet him again because he'd already had the opportunity many times to meet him before. And it's tough. It's tough. These individuals have had such an impact on our lives, and they aren't going to be around forever. But certainly he will always be remembered and celebrated, and just bringing to life this amazing character. And the guy that co-hosts the show with me, my weekly radio show, he even made a comment, and he's a big Star Wars fan, but not obviously as hardcore as I am. But even he made a comment in regard to Peter Mayhew, how he created such an iconic character, but you never saw his face, and yet he's so recognizable in public. So Peter Mayhew, thank you so much for the joy that you've brought this fan. I know that you were, staring down from wherever you are and smiling or growling in that Wookiee voice, seeing the outpouring of emotion and love back to you that you brought to us all these years. And I can't. I wish I had the opportunity to meet the man, and he's going to be missed.
My Nerd World.
All right, let's get into it. A little bit of a discussion before we dive into spoilers this week. And if you've listened to the show for, if you've listened to the show before, you kind of know how I handle this, but I want to sort of set some ground rules. I'm fairly open when it comes to spoilers and things that I learn about the new films. I'll give you a warning, but I tend not to go and put things at the end. If you're listening to the show, you're probably going to get a fair amount of certainly the Target, Walmart spoilers, the stuff that you would see on store shelves. If we go deeper than that, to the point where I even end up using my stupid little sounder, which we definitely will today.
The hyperdrive is leaking. Right.
If we go that route, I'm going to give you a little bit of a warning. So on the show this week, when we get into spoiler material, there's some stuff that's very sort of surface level, some potential details about battles that may take place on particular planets. I'll give you a warning before that. Before we get into listener feedback this week, though, there is some really big stuff we're going to dive into. And this is potentially things that could lay out how the end of this film plays out. I will give you fair warning before we get to that point. This is taken from MakingStarWars.net. As a matter of fact, just moving forward, so I don't have to keep repeating myself, almost all of the stuff that I'm sharing on the show this week is coming from Jason Ward and MakingStarWars.net. So if you want to go and read the original articles, go to his website. But my stack of papers that I have in front of me is mostly stuff, if not all stuff, that Jason has posted up on his website and subsequently shared on the Reddit's leaks page. So before we get into listener feedback, I'll give you a fair warning before we get into that end of the Rise of Skywalker speculation stuff. None of it is set in stone. This is just what Jason Ward has been hearing. It is pretty big, though, and even I was questioning whether or not I wanted to go and address it on the show. That being said, I know about it, and I like to share what I know and my thoughts. So I'll give you the opportunity to jump out of the show and then hop over to listener feedback if you don't want to know this, again, potential big spoiler when it comes to the end of the film. All right, so first, let's get into some commentary this week before we dive into the meat and the news and the spoilers of this week's May the 4th episode.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
We know that we're going to be getting some stuff from StarWars.com today, and I even thought about delaying the show until later in the day, depending on what StarWars.com releases. My expectation is that for May the 4th, anything that Star Wars puts out in celebration of today is probably not going to be the Rise of Skywalker related. I think if we get anything big today, we will probably get some of the Mandalorian stuff that was not shown to the public at Star Wars Celebration. Now, in the event that they do end up releasing something big when it comes to the Rise of Skywalker, I may put out a special bonus podcast if it's anything really, really noteworthy that I want to make sure I cover before next week. But I imagine most of the stuff that'll come out today for today's celebration, I'll probably be addressing on next week's show, just because we have so much for this show. But for May the 4th and the Star Wars, day, I wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about the movies in and of themselves as a celebration of Star Wars as a whole. And I want to use the fantastic women over at Girls with Sabers as my jump-off point. They put up a post on Instagram and I think on Twitter as well, but I think they put it up on Instagram initially, and you can see it on their Instagram feed. This idea that these movies, these 3 trilogies, are 3-act stories within 3-act stories. And I really, really love that idea. Because in my opinion, it is true. Whether or not that was always the intention, because we have so many different individuals involved in the creative process for all these films, the reality is, in my opinion, and what Girls with Sabers is saying is, I absolutely agree. Each of these trilogies takes place in 3 acts within the trilogy, but if you look at all 9 movies as a whole, the 9 trilogies act as 3-act stories. Prequels, original trilogies, and sequels. And in my opinion, it really works well that way. Now, I draw on a lot of personal experience. This is a way for me to talk about my novel and the trilogy that I am writing, but at the same time, it also, honestly, is a way that I can sort of relate to what I want to explain when it comes to Star Wars based off of my own experience of storytelling. Right now, I'm in the middle of editing. I've actually handed the follow-up book to my science fiction novel, Embark. The follow-up, the middle chapter of my trilogy, is called Treasure in Darkness. I've actually handed the book over to a handful of beta readers, and I hope to get a response by the end of next week on and get their thoughts on the story. I really like it, but it was a difficult story to craft. The reason being is that I know, and I knew all along, how the first story was going to play out. I knew how we were going to get our heroes, Taft and Katha, and how we were going to have the rise of our villain, Sin Argam. I know how the trilogy is going to wrap up. I had a very vague idea of the personal story that I was going to tell in the middle, which is the book right now that is currently in the editing process that the beta readers are reading. When you look at all 3 of these trilogies, and then when you also look at each of the trilogies individually, it's very much the same thing. So, looking at the prequel trilogy, and I love at the moment, I love the middle chapters of all 3 of these trilogies the most. I love those middle chapters because they are complex. And to me, the middle chapters are the ones that the writers and creators have had to struggle with the most, in my opinion. George Lucas, when writing and I'm doing just a lot of speculation here, right? Just based off of what I know from listening to countless commentaries and interviews. But when you look at the prequel trilogy, it's pretty clear that George had a good idea of how this was going to start with the Immaculate Conception, right? The Force conception of Anakin Skywalker with Shmi, which we may or may not get more backstory on when it comes to the Rise of Skywalker, and seeing Anakin as a child and how special he was and how he ended up being found by the Jedi. That's a pretty easy start and story to tell. You get a fairly straightforward story in The Phantom Menace of Anakin's story, along with this struggle with the taxation and something that mirrors A New Hope. You know how, and George knows how Revenge of the Sith is going to play out, how the third story, how Episode 3 is going to play out, because we know that this is where Anakin turns to the dark side. And we know that it has been established and was established in canon long before he filmed that movie that there would be this battle that would take place on somewhere around lava, most likely involving Obi-Wan Kenobi, where he would end up becoming Darth Vader. But that middle chapter is the one that you struggle with. And what I love about Attack of the Clones is that, to me, within that struggle of having to craft this story where you need to progress our characters beyond where they started to get them to where they need to go, you get really interesting stories doing that. Sometimes they're different stories. In the case of Attack of the Clones, you get this mystery, right? You almost get this film noir version of Star Wars. You get this younger, confused, whiny version of Anakin Skywalker, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on when I talk further about my double feature that I'm going to do today, right? With The Empire Strikes Back, you get something very similar. You get a very character-driven story, not quite as clear of a through line in terms of plot. Characters are being split up. They're having to go their separate ways. They're having to be challenged in ways that they weren't in the first story, all to bring them to the last and final story, which is, Return of the Jedi, where the heroes rise to the occasion, they defeat the enemy, and they defeat evil, once and for all. But that middle chapter of The Empire Strikes Back is the one that's filled with the most conflict. I mean, this is basic, 3-arc storytelling in and of itself. And Lawrence Kasdan talked about writing The Empire Strikes Back and how, this is how all hell breaks loose. And usually the middle chapter is the best chapter. And so far, we see something very similar play out with The Last Jedi. Again, minus the controversy from the people that don't like it. I happen to love it. But very much in the same vein of Attack of the Clones and The Empire Strikes Back, you get a much different story than the story that kicked off that particular trilogy. You have a story where the characters once again need to be put through trials and tribulations to grow, to bring everybody to the final act. Okay. Now, if you look at all 3 trilogies as a whole in that light, it actually works really well, especially the mirroring going on between the prequel trilogy and the sequel trilogy. So in the prequel trilogy, we get the establishment of how all this stuff ended up playing out with our core characters. This is what happened to Anakin, the Chosen One prophecy. This is what the Republic looked like at the time. We get to the middle chapter, and the middle chapter in and of itself, and this is where I think they kind of fell into it, because with the original trilogy being filmed and put out right before anything else, before George knew he was going to do the other films, with the limitations of the day, you get this, for its time, epic space opera of episodes 4, 5, and 6 that really are now, in retrospect, looking at all 3 trilogies, character studies. Sure, they're grand and they're epic, but because of the limitations of the time, they are simpler in the way that the story plays out. So you start off with this larger sort of complex establishment of the galaxy, the characters, where are we getting our villain from? You get to the middle trilogy, and this is where we learn about the new characters, core characters of the story, but they're going through simpler tales as they work through their own 3-arc storytelling within the original trilogy. And then that brings you to this sequel trilogy, which now, again, we're kind of working in reverse, where we're almost seeing this powerful force that's trying to come to fruition, that's trying to gain a hold of the galaxy, not in the way that the Empire had, but they're not at the point that the Empire was at. You're trying to see them play out. And it ends up being this nice combination, in my opinion, of what we got in the original trilogy and also what we got in the prequel trilogy, with a new set of characters heading into Episode 9 and the Rise of Skywalker, where we are being told, and it certainly seems that way, that we're going to get this epic conclusion that will tie all of these films together. All 3 larger chapters, prequels, original trilogy, and sequel trilogies, are all very different in and of themselves, but in completing that full 3-story arc within 9 movies, I really think that at the end of all of this, with these 9 films, we are going to be looking at this, over 40-year development of this the most amazing science fiction space opera story that we've ever seen before, apart from the story that I'm writing. I'm just kidding. I don't expect my Embark trilogy to be if it's a quarter as good as Star Wars, I will be tickled. I will be absolutely tickled. But I'm excited for that, especially when looking at what the MCU has done, and because of how much discussion in the fandom right now in pop culture surrounds what the MCU has accomplished and what the the Marvel movies have done and what Infinity War and Endgame have done. It's all great. I all love that. As I mentioned on last week's show, I love Star Wars more. And I really do think that Star Wars sets itself apart from the MCU, obviously because of the storytelling, the science fiction aspect of it, the space opera aspect of it, but the mythology part of it. And that's why I love Star Wars. The MCU is fun. Superheroes are fun. Those stories are a lot of fun. I enjoyed them. I look forward to the films being released. And I know that it gets a lot of praise for what the Marvel Cinematic Universe was able to do. I really do think that on a long enough timeline, when we look back at this full 9-story Skywalker saga, I really do think that it's going to go down as even more so than we already know. Because right now we're still kind of mired in this idea the prequels weren't what everybody wanted. I think a lot of that has to do with the rise of commentary and social media and the ability that people have to express their opinion at any moment of any given day, anywhere on the internet for everybody to see. If the prequels had come out and we didn't have that, like the prequels coming out at the same sort of limitations that we had during the original trilogy, I personally think it would have been much different, but be that as it may. My point is, in retrospect, I think these 9 films together as a whole are going to get a lot more respect for what they were able to accomplish than they do right now, and be looked upon, and this is where my hot take comes in. I think the 9-story Star Wars Skywalker saga will be just as revered as the Marvel Cinematic Universe in what it was able to accomplish. I think right now a lot of people, and I've heard a lot of people discussing this, talking about how right now Marvel has superseded Star Wars as the #1 intellectual property, and I don't care. And I don't even necessarily disagree. I think these things are cyclical. And I've mentioned before, I don't rank the movies anymore personally because they shift. My favorite films in the saga shift around. Right now, The Last Jedi is still my favorite Star Wars film at the moment. But oddly, coming in a bizarre #2, very close to Empire Strikes Back, is Attack of the Clones, which I'll get into in just a moment. But I wanted to just share my thoughts on that on this May the 4th holiday. I'm curious to get your opinion on that, and how will these 9 films in the Skywalker saga be looked at as a whole? Because this is really the first time that we've ever seen anything like this happen, and I think that's special in and of itself, too. When you look at other properties that have had multiple films, right, and we'll throw out Terminator or Aliens or Harry Potter. Harry Potter, kind of like the MCU, was able to do this very long but consistent through line of creating all those movies. I mean, we're looking at a 9-story arc of films that started way back in the 70s. I don't think that you can, at least nothing's popping into my head right now that comes into comparison. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on how you think these 9 films will be looked at in the future in retrospect, once we get some distance on it, and how much of that is going to depend on how the Rise of Skywalker plays out, because I think that needs to be noted as well. I think a lot of this is really going to be, what does the Rise of Skywalker do in completing these 9 stories? And if J.J. Abrams is able to really bring it home, and he's right in his own opinion that he's created something special and they've pulled it off, then I really do think that's obviously a better opportunity for those 9 films to be looked at in a much grander light, certainly the prequels, than if JJ just sort of delivers a mediocre film, which I don't personally expect that he is going to do. I think that we are on the. I think that we're getting ready to witness something incredibly special with the Rise of Skywalker. I just have a really, really good feeling about it.
This is not going to go the way you think.
Okay, one more quick thought for May the 4th, and then we'll dive into the news and the spoilers that I was teasing prior. And that is the double feature that I'm planning on doing today, that is Attack of the Clones and The Last Jedi. The Anakin and Padme dynamic, because of what we've seen in the sequel trilogy, it has a real fresh feel for me now. Even the cheesy scenes. For me personally, what The Force Awakens, and certainly what Rian Johnson was able to do with The Last Jedi, has shed new light on Attack of the Clones. Because those films actually do have a lot in common, in my opinion. On top of being those middle chapters of a 3-chapter, of a 3-arc story that I talked about earlier. On top of the fact that the middle story is always the most difficult one to craft, because you got to get everybody to a place where they can get to the 3rd act of the story, which is the big, culmination of all 3 stories. What Rian Johnson did with The Last Jedi is almost an adult version, if you will, and I don't really know how else to word it. It's almost an adult version of what we kind of got with that romance between Anakin and Padme. Now, the Anakin and Padme romance was way more on the nose, obviously, than Reylo is. Okay, that's still obviously a point of contention, whether or not that connection the two of them have is on a romantic level or just on a force level. They're both going through stuff kind of level. I view it currently on a romantic level, but I'm also very much open to that changing, right? We're also talking about characters that are in much different spaces too, right? Especially with Anakin. In Attack of the Clones, you've got Anakin Skywalker and a young Hayden Christensen. He's in a mess of trouble dealing with his very legit feelings of love for this beautiful girl in Padme that he met at a young age. But he's also not mature enough to go and deal with those. And that's the part of it that The Last Jedi really helped for me in going back and watching Attack of the Clones and sort of allowing myself to move past the cheesy dialogue and to look at Anakin Skywalker as more of a kid who didn't have a proper father growing up, didn't have the opportunity to be in relationships, a lot like Kylo, and I've gotten into this in previous podcasts, where certainly you can go and question the way in which, George Lucas handled the dialogue and how it's delivered, but be that as it may, this is a kid that doesn't have any experience in love, who has real feelings. And that's the part of it that I think is very different, at least the way the story is told in Attack of the Clones. This isn't so much a matter of, I'm a young, powerful, would-be Padawan, soon-to-be Jedi who's seen this beautiful woman in Padme, and I'm just, I'm crushing on her. No, he has legitimate feelings of love, which makes that even worse, right? Plus, at the end of Attack of the Clones, you get this situation where you couple that with this kid who's dealing with this love, who put himself out on a limb in that fireplace scene with Padme, looking beautiful in that dark dress with the very foreshadowing, choker that's connected to the dress, right? That black dress in the fire scene. I wish I could wish away my feelings. That scene used to bug the daylights out of me, but it's so pivotal because Anakin puts himself out there, and he gets the admission that she feels the same way, but the rejection at the same time, right? And if you're a dude listening, you know how much that sucks. If you're a girl listening, you know how much damage that can do to a dude. Where, yeah, I like you too, dude, but I'm not going there. Oh, right? It's devastating. So he works himself through that in the middle of this galactic conflict, only to be potentially staring down death and to have Padme come full circle and admit her love to him, right? Which really cements his downfall. And I'm not blaming Padme. Ultimately, Anakin goes and makes the right decision under the influence of Palpatine, which, by the way, also I find very interesting, which we'll get into here in a moment too, because that mirrors The Last Jedi as well, when you're talking about the influence of others on these individuals that are already emotionally compromised, and how that can lead to a path of redemption, because as a viewer, you can see that individual as more of a sympathetic figure who was influenced by somebody. Admittedly, they accepted that influence. They allowed themselves to be influenced. But be that as it may, it wasn't entirely their fault. So Padme and Anakin going so far as to get married, right? Now he's committed. He has the woman he loves, but he also wants to be a Jedi, and he cannot reconcile that. And then when, in my opinion, he gets these visions, perhaps placed there by Darth Sidious, Palpatine, which is what I'd like to believe. I don't know if that's been established otherwise. I haven't read the prequel novels to know if they put any details in there. But I like to believe that much in the same way that Snoke was influencing Kylo Ren, that Ben Solo, that Palpatine was also planting those visions inside of Anakin's head, pushing him towards towards Palpatine in order to allow Palpatine to go and seduce him to the dark side by saying that he's the only one that can save the girl that he loves, ultimately leading to his downfall, right? And you get that same type of dynamic, but entirely different circumstances going on in The Last Jedi. You have an individual here who's completely conflicted about whether or not he wants to be dark side or light side. He's killed his father for whatever reason he is justified in his own mind. And now he comes across this girl. And this is where, again, this is some of my headcanon, but this is how I view it. He comes across this girl in Rey. He gets into her head, and much like Anakin, the dude's got no experience when it comes to love. He had his master, in his mind, turn his back on him and betray him. He's turned to the dark side, and the only people that he thinks understands him in following the leadership of Snoke, and we'll get into a bit of this with spoilers later on. So then he finds this beautiful girl in the same way that Anakin did. He gets into her head only to find out, oh, crap, she's got a lot of power. She's actually pushing back on me. To the point where at the end of The Force Awakens, he's pulling his punches. You know, you need a teacher. I can show you the ways of the Force. He's not fully committing to that. He can't. He knows he's got some connection to this girl. He doesn't want to kill her. He wants to potentially, you know, have a relationship with her, but also bring her over to his side. Maybe that's his way of doing that. And I fully believe that he was pulling his punches and pulled them to the point where he allowed her the opportunity to tap into the Force and then have Rey kick his butt there at the end. I don't think that Kylo Ren is all that butt sore at the end. At the end of The Force Awakens. I really, really don't. I think that in that moment, he gets his butt kicked, he's wounded, he's been shot, he's emotionally compromised because he just killed his father. He's now had to battle this girl that he's got this connection to that he doesn't know how to deal with. So by the time we get into The Last Jedi, now we're in a very much a similar situation with extremely different circumstances than Anakin was in Attack of the Clones. He's now having to deal with something very similar in The Last Jedi, and we have to see these characters go through this together. So the big question is, how does this wrap up in The Rise of Skywalker? Okay, and I'm going to save more commentary on that until we get into the spoiler stuff, because that's where some of this stuff is going to lead in the really heavy spoiler portion of the show this week. The other thing I wanted to mention too, somebody on another podcast was talking about The Last Jedi and mentioned how challenging it is. The argument that they were making that I don't necessarily agree with is they were criticizing movies like Solo and even Rogue One for being, for lack of a better word, and I'll kind of paraphrase, for being fan service, right? We didn't need to know the story of Solo. We didn't need to know where he got his blaster from. We didn't need to know how he got his name. I don't care. I enjoyed all of that. Rogue One, same thing. We didn't need to know how they got the Death Star plans, right? Okay, I don't care. I'm glad that they did. I enjoy the movies for what they are. But he was very complimentary of The Last Jedi in how challenging it was in breaking conventions and offering new things. And again, I tend to agree with that. And as an example, going back to, and in this case, we'll look at the middle chapter of the original trilogy. You look at A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back, right? When you get to The Empire Strikes Back coming off A New Hope, something very similar that happens in The Last Jedi happened first in those two movies. When you get to The Empire Strikes Back, we suddenly find out about new Force powers. At the beginning of the film, we're given the example of how Luke can use the Force to pull objects. We didn't know that beforehand in A New Hope, right? We knew that they had powers, but we really didn't see them fully on display like that, okay? We knew that Obi-Wan, in his passing, spoiler alert, after being killed by Darth Vader, spoiler alert, we know that he could communicate through the Force even in death, but we really didn't see any of those special Jedi powers, right? Because the prequels obviously weren't out yet. So when you get to The Empire Strikes Back, you get the Force powers aspect of it, being able to move objects, throw objects around. The Force connections, kind of where we first see we didn't really see it in A New Hope, apart from Obi-Wan and Luke Skywalker in A New Hope. we now see, Luke can actually do this with the living, and Leia at the end of the Empire Strikes Back. The visions, the dark side cave on Dagobah, and seeing a potential vision of the future, Luke facing his greatest fear when he battles a vision of Vader, chops his head off, and then he sees his face underneath the mask. That's his greatest fear, that he's going to end up, becoming like this horrible person. Rey faces something similar when she gets to the dark side cave in the Last Jedi. Faces her greatest fear, that she doesn't come from anybody. She has to dig deep to find out who she is. She can't rely on the legacy of somebody else's past. She has to pull that power from herself. Force ghosts. We didn't know about Force ghosts, right? So we're exposed to all these things in The Empire Strikes Back. Okay. So when you get to the sequel trilogy, we rediscover these powers again through Rey, and then The Last Jedi does something very similar, The Last Jedi compared to The Force Awakens, where it's expanded even further. Leia saves herself after being blown out of the bridge, being fired upon by the First Order forces when Kylo Ren pulled his punch, right? The Force Skype sessions between Kylo Ren and Rey. Luke's powerful ultimate Jedi move, Force projection. This idea, the vanity that only the Jedi can engage with the Force, which I attribute to people in the real world. Not everyone can do everything. It's a skill. Not everybody can be a long-distance track runner. Not everybody can be a sharpshooter. Not everybody can be a brave member of our military. Not everybody can write. Not everybody can talk on a microphone. Right? That's the Star Wars version of the Force and what we were introduced through Rian Johnson. And that's what I also love about The Last Jedi, is the fact that we do end up being introduced to these things that, while they are different and they're riffs on things that we have seen before, but not things that we've seen before, it is very much in the same vein of what we saw in the original trilogy. And then you go all the way back to the prequel trilogy, and of course we see all the Jedi and they're in their heyday, right? Prequels, we get the full-fledged Jedi. Original trilogies, we discover the new powers through Luke. And then the sequel trilogy, we rediscover these things again, and we get a further understanding of the Force leading into the Rise of Skywalker. And I really, really relish what's happened in these movies of this original idea of what the Jedi were supposed to be, and how we get to The Last Jedi and suddenly Luke is there saying, man, the Jedi got it wrong. This is what it's really about. This is really us figuring this out. And there's a larger point that I want to make. And I'm gonna save it until the end of the podcast, or the end of the content portion, before we get to listener feedback, to really dive into it. But just to kind of give you a bit of a preview, I am very much hoping that the Rise of Skywalker delicately and in a very smart way, which you can do, fundamentally changes some understandings of things that we thought that we knew throughout the other 8 movies. I'm completely down with that. I want the full arc in these 9 films. I'm not the biggest Harry Potter fan. I really respect the mythology that J.K. Rowling was able to create. I love the last couple of films, having not read the books. I love the last couple of films because they do give you a full explanation of the mythology, and it all ends up working out in the end. And that's what I want from the Rise of Skywalker. That's what I'm really hoping that we get. That we get some revelations that smartly and very much justified change some things that we thought that we knew. And I'm going to provide a lot more detail about that when we get into the heavy spoiler portion of this week's show. Right now, let's dive into some news. This is not really spoiler stuff. This is more surface level news stuff.
Fulfill your destiny.
So this is kind of a list of items that got posted. This came off of the Making Star Wars, or the Now this is podcasting, MakingStarWars.net podcast. So the first little detail we get here is apparently the Cassian Andor Disney Plus TV show, the code name is Whitesnake. The only reason I can think it's Whitesnake is because of Cassian Andor being a loner. Here I go again on my own. Can you imagine K2SO singing that? Going down the only road I've ever known. Sorry, I apologize. That was not rad. Who knows why it's codenamed Whitesnake? That's just the first thing that popped into my head. That actually fits more The Mandalorian if you want to really get down to it. But be that as it may, the Cassian Andor show is codenamed Whitesnake. The Rise of Skywalker props are being kept in the Dagenham for reshoots. So apparently there's this new studio being built, this massive studio being built. They're no longer going to be shooting at Pinewood the way that they used to. And apparently Cassian Andor will film this fall at the Dagenham studio. Dagenham studio site is ready to go. Benioff and Wise are expected to film there. Now, this is what I find really interesting. The Star Wars movie hiatus that we were told about is due to the construction of the new studio, and this will allow Benioff and Wise to create the best possible saga without an unreasonable crunch time. Okay? Filming is underway currently at Greenhand Common, which is an area The Force Awakens filmed, but it's unconfirmed that this is actually for Star Wars. Also, the Rise of Skywalker first cut apparently screened at Bad Robot last week. So just a couple of details there. The thing that I am very curious about is, and this is a bit of news, so next year we're going back to Anaheim for Star Wars Celebration. And I'm actually planning on going, that's where I was kind of born and raised, in that area of Southern California. I'm planning on going to Star Wars Celebration next April for the week. I'm planning on going to the actual convention, and then hopefully going to spend some time at Disneyland with the family. I'm really, really hoping, and I'm going to spend the next year, essentially, working on doing this show live at Star Wars Celebration next year. And the way that the show has grown as of late, thanks to you, I cannot thank you enough. I am personally really excited at the opportunity of hopefully, for those of you that have the means to go, of hopefully meeting as many of the My Nerd World Star Wars podcast listeners as possible next year. I'm kind of giddy over the idea and really hoping that I can do a live show there on the podcast stage next year. The thing that I'm most curious about, though, is that they are doing another convention next year, and we don't have a movie coming out next year, a Star Wars movie coming out next year. So I am wondering if we haven't been given details about something yet. I know they said they're going to put the movies on hiatus. There's some speculation that that hiatus was more, and I think Christian Harloff on Collider mentioned this, but there's some speculation that hiatus was more the Skywalker saga than it was the other films. Because there was a report that came out, and I believe that that Star Wars Newsnet.com had reported on this extensively. And that was that the Benioff and Wise, that there was a movie in production, that they were already well into the production phase of the film, and that might have been the Benioff and Wise. And I spent time talking about it on a previous show, that I was under the impression, based off of that news and whether or not that leak, that rumor, if it were true, that we would be getting a movie at the end of next year. So the big question that I have is, if we're having a celebration in Anaheim, of all places, next year, what's going to be the big draw like Episode 9 was this year? Maybe, who knows? Maybe today we get an announcement of some sort for Star Wars Day, which is possible. Who knows? Anyway, so that's the more surface level news for this week. What we're going to get into now is some of the events on one of the planets for the Rise of Skywalker. So this is mild stuff, more details, less mythology plot stuff. So, again, this is more stuff that you could probably glean from your Target and Walmart toys when they get released. So, this is not the heavy spoiler stuff. Be that as it may, I will go ahead and toss the warning on top of it just to be sure. But before I get to the really heavy stuff, I will give you plenty of warning.
The hyperdrive is leaking.
Okay, so, my gosh, that's just the worst thing. That is not rad. That's just the, it's just the worst transition. Now I can't not use it, though. Right? Like, it's so bad, I can't not use it now. All right. So, again, all from MakingStarWars.net. At the end of the second act of Star Wars, The Rise of Skywalker, we arrive at a jungle planet. The jungle planet is a location everyone meets before the heroes go on to their climactic encounters with evil at the end of the film. But apparently things do not all go as planned during the resistance planning sequence of the film, and a skirmish breaks out. This is what we saw being filmed in Black Park with the Orange X-Wing and the Millennium Falcon. There appears to be a sequence where the heroes go down into a cave earlier on. If you recall, we get covered aspects of a cave, and we covered aspects of a cave entrance being built using a huge prefabricated rocks last summer. It sounds like the heroes enter the cave, and that is where they are introduced to Claude, the giant slug-looking thing that was on that promo poster, who agrees to help the Resistance fighters. Details are sparse, but Jason goes on to say, I have seen evidence that the Falcon has a pretty bad fire on this jungle world. It does seem like the Falcon makes it off the planet, but it does make me wonder if the Falcon is damaged for the majority of the film. However, this being the end of the second act, we can't be certain that the Falcon makes it. The Falcon seems to get a lot of abuse in the film. Following the introduction of Claude, a resistance meeting takes place that takes our heroes to the ending. This sounds like the map room sequence from The Force Awakens, where we learn what the heroes need to do and what they're up against. We have heard that the interiors of the cave and some interiors for this sequence were also shot at Pinewood. In addition to the Black Park stuff that we covered over the summer, Black Park appears to have been used for the jungle planet, the swamp planet, and we believe the exterior of the droid factory where Dio is introduced. There's a piece of concept art that was recently tweeted out from the Art of the Force Awakens by Phil Sostak. It shows a droid repair recycling facility on a Star Destroyer. He shared it on Twitter recently, and it appears to be very similar to what we've heard about Dio's introduction on the Snow Planet. Sources have indicated that J.J. Abrams seems to be using a lot of ideas from The Force Awakens in this film that didn't fit into that movie, but fit perfectly into this one. We've now seen many instances of this from just cool ideas that didn't fit out of some necessity. The Resistance and the First Order soldiers appear to face off on this world. I was told the sequence where Kylo slams the guy down in the trailer is on the Swamp Planet and involved 20 Swamp Warriors in total. This planet has the Resistance troopers with the big hats that seem derivative of the Endor rebel soldiers from Return of the Jedi. This appears to be where we heard about the actors joking it was difficult to march like an actual army, and our source spotted the first woman to play a stormtrooper back in the costume for another Star Wars film. Another interesting thing I've learned about the jungle planet is that some walkers, not seen since Attack of the Clones, are said to be involved in the jungle world sequence. Does Claude provide the Resistance with something momentarily to thwart a First Order attack? Is the Falcon damaged when they arrive, or in an attack after a meeting? We have walkers from Attack of the Clones, the Falcon on fire, the First Order troopers attacking the heroes. We are assuming the walkers are ATTEs. We'll have to see how all this shakes out. It sounds exciting with a lot of classic Star Wars elements. There's a lot to unpack here. Have fun, and may the 4th be with you. And again, this is all from MakingStarWars.net. So this is this really kind of throws a monkey wrench into a couple of things that we thought were taking place. And it might just be due to the fact that J.J. Abrams misspoke. But in the panel for The Rise of Skywalker, they showed an image that showed the Millennium Falcon and our heroes on what looked to be this jungle planet. They also showed an image of Rey walking through with her staff on what appeared to be this forest or jungle planet. J.J. Abrams made a comment that first shot with the Millennium Falcon and the heroes was actually the beginning of the film. So I guess the question kind of comes into, okay, was J.J. wrong and it's not the beginning of the film? Or is that particular location, because Jason Ward is saying this is the middle of the story, is that location that they showed the picture of actually not this particular jungle planet that Jason is referring to here? Which also raises the question of, well, when does the desert sequence come into play? Because the big sort of, the speculation is that the movie's probably going to wrap up on whatever planet that piece of the Death Star is on, unless that's completely thrown off. So it's kind of tough putting together the pieces. What I do think is fairly certain is that we're going to have a pretty good idea how this movie shakes out before it arrives in theaters in December, much in the same way that those that follow this stuff knew how the movie was going to play out for The Force Awakens, at least the story beats and where everybody was going and when. It kind of makes sense to me that the scene that we see in the trailer at the beginning when Rey does her force flip over the TIE silencer, it would make some sense to me that's the beginning of the film. That is sort of extrapolating that J.J. Abrams has the film play out similar to what Return of the Jedi was, and we start back off on a desert planet in the same way that we started back off on Tatooine, and it would make sense that would be Jakku. Right? The middle planet part of it would also make some sense of a jungle planet if we're mirroring Endor, or if we go back to Endor. Somebody made a really good point on Reddit that what if the jungle planet is actually Kashyyyk, which would make sense if we've got older prequel era AT-TEs, right? If it was Kashyyyk, that would make sense that they were there. All of this stuff has me super excited, though. I really like the idea of how this is playing out. And again, that's an understatement. Of course, I'm going to be excited about it. But this idea and what John Boyega has said, that this movie is, sort of total war, right? This makes a lot more sense that we're going to a lot of different places. We've got a desert planet. We allegedly have a swamp planet and a forest planet. Now, that could also mean we've got another planet where the Death Star is at, along with whatever place we went to in the shot in the teaser of the sort of mountain ranges, the snow planet with the droid factory, and what looked to be the same ship that left a young Rey nobody on Jakku. So this movie, just based off of what we know so far, does seem to have this grand, massive scale that we've been hearing it's supposed to have. Piecing everything together, I have to continue to remind myself of how confused I was based off of what I had learned about The Last Jedi, and I could not rectify how the battle between Kylo Ren and Rey was going to shake out and how Rey was going to end up on Crate at the end of the film. I could not, because we knew that based off of some of the toy leaks that Rey ended up on Crate at the end of the movie. A lot of that was based off the assumption that battle that Kylo Ren and Rey had in the middle of the Last Jedi was going to take place at the end of The Last Jedi. So again, there's no real way to know unless it's completely laid out for you, or we end up getting spoiled ahead of time, or you just wait till the movie comes out, which is totally fine too. All right, so here's the deal. If you want to avoid all of the heavy spoilers that I'm about to get into, forward the podcast to 1 hour and 19 minutes in, and we'll start the listener feedback portion of the show. I don't normally do this, but we're getting into some really heavy spoiler material at this part of the podcast. Also, I've done some editing with this and had to move a few things around, and I've had a chance to already listen to the commentary you're about to hear over these massive spoilers. I want to preface something, going back and listening to my commentary. A couple times I say things like I'm convinced. This is all still speculation in my mind. I think these ideas are really cool. I think these leaks, there's some legitimacy to these leaks, but I also fully admit that there's a lot of this that could be just completely off base, based off of people's interpretation of things that they might have seen. So the language that I use is a lot of me just verbal vomit of me moving through this material. So when I say things like I'm convinced, it's all under this umbrella of pure speculation. I just like the speculation part of all of this. So I don't believe that any of this is 100% going to happen. And again, for me personally, if it doesn't, I trust the storytellers to present to us and create a story that they want to create that wraps up this whole saga. So if it sounds like I'm convinced that all this stuff is going to be 100% legit, I'm not. I'm just working through the material and using words like I'm convinced, when in reality is, no, this is all just still speculation based off of some fairly well substantiated rumors. So again, you want to avoid all of it, skip ahead to 1 hour and 19 minutes into the podcast, and we will get into the listener feedback portion of the show. However, this is your last chance to turn away. If not, let's go ahead and get into the real heavy, the Rise of Skywalker information.
The hyperdrive is leaking.
Boy, that really is just bad. It's really bad. It's really just not good. It's not good at all.
Something inside me has always been there.
This is better.
But now it's awake.
That is.
And I need help.
I do too. I need help.
The hyperdrive is leaking.
All right, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go in order of how these leaks broke out. So we had this massive spoiler dump that Jason Ward over MakingStarWars.net put out. So that came first. But after this came out, somebody went and grabbed something from, of all places, 4chan that was posted back on February 17th of this year. What's interesting about this particular leak from 4chan, which I don't ever put any stock in, is the fact that this actually lines up perfectly with what Jason Ward is saying how the final confrontation plays out in the Rise of Skywalker. So what I decided was it was best to start off with what this February leak was, because it's more broad than the specifics of what Jason said. And then we'll get into what Jason said. So this is more in order of what got leaked beforehand. Okay, so this is what was written originally. Palpatine is back. Now, again, this was back in February. So either this person did a really, really good job of guessing, or they had inside information. Palpatine is back, but not how you'd expect. A copy of his consciousness is held within an item. This is the MacGuffin. Okay? He possessed a body and ruled as Snoke. When Snoke was cut in half, the consciousness returned to the MacGuffin. Kylo needs to destroy the MacGuffin to stop Palpatine, reclaiming the First Order through another host. The Knights of Ren return to Kylo with info on where they think it is. Kylo and Rey team up to destroy Palpatine once and for all. The twist is that Matt Smith is already possessed when they return to Kylo and eventually turns on him. Lucasfilm have been leaving breadcrumbs and have already made this possible in canon with the Moment Mask. Palpatine has been the main villain since Episode 1. So I won't get too into details because I haven't read the comic itself. I've only read the frames, but there's an arc in the Vader comics where there's this mask that brings back this Darksider moment, and his consciousness is embodied in this mask, and that's how he's brought back to life. I know a lot of people are drawing correlations with going back to Harry Potter with Horcruxes and what Voldemort was able to do. Look, these types of tropes of mythology have been around forever. They're not exclusive to Harry Potter. So I personally have no problem with these being used in these films. So this particular leak back from February really aligns with what Jason Ward put out. And then I'm going to double back to a couple of different items in this. Now, before we get into Jason Ward stuff, I do want to lend some credibility to what I'm about to share, because the guy that moderates the Reddit Leaks page put up a post after Jason Ward put up his post. And this is what he said, because he does a really good job. The person, Spartacus, not Spartacus, I think that's his name, they do a really good job of substantiating the rumors on the Reddit Leaks page to make sure that there's not a bunch of garbage being put up on the website. So he said this: I wanted to let you all know that within the last few weeks, I've received independent corroboration, though not confirmation, that some of the rumors that we've been hearing appear to be legitimate. I know the next part is going to be frustrating, but to protect the integrity of the source and people's jobs, I can't say which rumors this source is fairly confident in. Now, I will say this all came up after Jason Ward's big info dump that I'm about to share with you. The important part of this post, however, is that unlike The Last Jedi, we are getting credible information about bigger plot points. I'm offering this as a warning so that those of you who want to know stuff but maybe not too much can have the option of leaving now. I hope this was helpful. Okay, so let's get into it. Huge rumor about how the final duel of Star Wars, The Rise of Skywalker, plays out. This is a rumor and not hard sources yet. So here we go. So again, I'm going to keep the original one over here to the side because it plays into it. So Matt Smith and the paddock. His character is connected to the 4-acre Pinewood Studios paddock according to a lot of sources. So this is the paddock lot that's being used at Pinewood to film scenes for The Rise of Skywalker. Jason goes on to say, I believe that the moment from the trailer where they observe the Death Star was filmed there for the crashing waves and such. That's where I believe they filmed the Death Star graveyard. Moments from Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker. So if I'm reading between the lines correctly, Smith didn't film at the paddock, but is connected to it because it's where they see the Death Star in the film. That location is where we believe they shot the Death Star coast. Now here's where a bit of confusion comes in on my part, because I was immediately under the assumption that that shot we see at the end of the trailer, before we hear the Palpatine laugh, was going to be the beginning of the film. And I was basing that off the fact of how clean Rey was. That being said, Rey can always change her clothes throughout the movie, right? She could have gone swimming and cleaned up her clothes. But if you look at her clothing by comparison to the first shot of the film, where she does her, her force backflip over the TIE silencer interceptor thing, her clothes do look cleaner. But be that as it may, that's the only reason I was placing any sort of time frame on either of those shots. My sources insist that Matt Smith is not a Knight of Ren or their leader. That always made sense to me because their name is pretty clear that Kylo Ren is their leader. It also doesn't sound like one tries to change them to the Knights of Ren. Matt Smith is the point, I guess. Kind of written wonky, but Matt Smith is confirmed for The Rise of Skywalker. So he actually did some work, and there was a Disney website, international Disney website, that confirmed Matt Smith's role in the film. So again, going back to it, Matt Smith is a bad guy, not a Knight of Ren. If you go back to that original leak, apparently Palpatine has possessed Matt Smith's body. Okay. This gives a lot of credibility, the Disney websites showing Matt Smith, to what we've been heard before, even though the company and even Matt Smith himself have not confirmed his role in the film. Okay. A really solid source over the years passed on something they heard internally. Okay. But this means this past solid source is using information that is once again somewhat unproven. Otherwise, I'd double down on this being 100%. But that said, I trust their judgment, and that's why I'm moving forward with this piece that very well may be wrong. However, I think we should see it as likely, but still be open to all possibilities. Okay. The rumor is that Matt Smith isn't Palpatine reborn, or rejuvenated, but a dark side acolyte. During The Rise of Skywalker, Smith's character is willfully possessed by the spirit of Emperor Palpatine. During the final act of the film, Kylo and Rey team up to fight Palpatine's possessed Matt Smith. The 2-on-1 duel is pretty intense for the duo. Eventually, Kylo Ren kills Palpatine's host body. Palpatine's spirit then jumps into Kylo Ren's body. Kylo Ren is strong enough to not lose total control of his mental faculties. Kylo Ren struggles to take control of his body, but subdues himself and his weapon while beckoning Rey to kill him. Kylo does the right thing and becomes Ben Solo again as he sacrifices himself to kill Palpatine. Rey, having never toyed with the dark side like Kylo Ren, and the Acolyte did, means Palpatine can't use her body, because her body isn't evil enough to inhabit. Now, I've got my own bit of speculation on how this plays out. I have no idea if this is the case, but I'm going to share it with you in just a moment. So you kind of follow here. So Matt Smith is possessed by Palpatine, which could potentially mean that Snoke was possessed by Palpatine. I'll get back to that in a moment. They all face off. Kylo Ren and Rey get together, kind of like we speculated and thought that they might, to end this ultimate evil. Kylo Ren, having toyed with the dark side for as long as he is susceptible to Palpatine finally possessing him. They kill Matt Smith. Palpatine jumps into Kylo Ren. Kylo Ren knows the only way that he can kill Palpatine is to have Rey kill him. And thusly, because of that, we get Ben Solo redeemed. I have my own version that I will share with you again in a moment of how I think that actually transpires. Getting back to what Jason Ward wrote. Once again, this is going around internally amongst people who may not have the full picture of the film. I think it's interesting. It seems possible. It has a very Exorcist-type vibe to it. I do believe that Rey does something pivotal that ends Kylo, but I haven't been able to discern if that is actually him dying or ceasing to be Kylo Ren and becoming Ben Solo. I'm personally treating the whole thing, says Jason Ward, as a developing story, and as more concrete details come out, hopefully we can figure things out, that we can get used to the ideas and the feel of the movie we're getting into this Christmas. The Last Jedi was rumored to have a marketing campaign around a new darkseid villain, but that was to be revealed, and I remember that too. And it was teased in the film, but from what I understand, that was scrapped for something else as time went on, and it never happened. I always believed that it was referenced in this IO9 article, which I don't have in front of me, that mentioned something along those lines from an official Lucasfilm magazine called The Souvenir Guide to the Movie Star Wars The Last Jedi. Let's see. Force-sensitive and highly attuned to the dark side, but not Sith, Snoke has trained Kylo Ren and at least one other apprentice, right? That we've heard all along, okay? Is that Matt Smith's character? Treat this as a rumor and don't spread it around on social media. Okay, so getting back to the leak that I mentioned a moment ago, the original one, right? Palpatine is back, but not how you'd expect. A copy of his consciousness is held within an item. He possessed a body ruled as Snoke. When Snoke was cut in half, his consciousness returned to the MacGuffin. Kylo needs to destroy the MacGuffin to stop Palpatine, reclaiming the First Order through another host. The Knights of Ren return to Kylo with info on where they think it is. Kylo and Rey team up to destroy Palpatine once and for all. Knights of Ren, Matt Smith is already possessed when they return Kylo. So this is really interesting given the fact that, again, that was back in February. Okay, so what does this whole thing mean? This is my theory, okay? Palpatine needs a host. Palpatine figured out a way to cheat death, and that's how this whole thing ties together. You go all the way back to Squid Lake in Revenge of the Sith, and it makes all the sense in the world that Palpatine figured out how to cheat death. He figured out how to cheat death, and he did so on the Death Star 2 in Return of the Jedi by having his essence essentially enter into an object, a MacGuffin. Okay. That object is the MacGuffin that everybody is looking for. That object gets destroyed after Palpatine is already in Matt Smith's body. Point being, when Matt Smith is killed, he can't do what he did when Snoke was killed. When Snoke was killed, he returned to whatever the MacGuffin is. Is it Vader's helmet? Is it Kylo Ren's mask? Be that as it may, I'm convinced that the MacGuffin is destroyed, therefore Palpatine has to have a host body in order to survive. Kylo Ren cuts down Matt Smith. Palpatine, Darth Sidious's essence, jumps into Kylo Ren. The rumor plays out like I just mentioned a moment ago, where Kylo Ren is able to hold his faculties long enough to have Rey strike him down, thus destroying Palpatine. But because of the fact that he can't go into an object, the MacGuffin that's already been destroyed, therefore, now he is completely destroyed. And because of that, that affords the opportunity for Ben Solo to ultimately be saved. If Palpatine was able to jump into another form or back into the MacGuffin, Kylo Ren couldn't live, he would die. But because he can't, and because they actually destroy Palpatine once and for all, the dark side dies and Ben Solo is redeemed. I wouldn't mind a fundamental change that makes sense for all of the movies, right? And again, the underlying point being that Palpatine found a way to cheat death. So here's my ultimate sort of theory on how this whole thing ends up playing out. What if Palpatine learned how to cheat death, and the way that he cheated death was being able to transfer his consciousness not only into an object, but to other people? The way that he cheated death all along was jumping into younger bodies. Now, Palpatine might have been the original Palpatine in The Phantom Menace, but be that as it may, let's go with that. So he's not exposed himself to be Darth Sidious yet. He's laying the groundwork in The Phantom Menace. He brings Darth Maul along as his apprentice, ultimately because he knows at some point in time, if he is ever in mortal danger, he can jump into Darth Maul and continue to live on. However, Darth Maul gets cut down. You jump forward to Revenge of the Sith. Still not Palpatine yet, right? He's got Dooku. Dooku's too old. He's got this young guy that he can jump into, Anakin Skywalker, who's strong in the Force and may even be the chosen one. I know. I'll get that dude to cut down Dooku. He will be my apprentice. And if I run into a circumstance where I am in mortal danger, I can jump into Anakin Skywalker. He exposes himself to be Darth Sidious, turns into the Emperor that we all know. Unfortunately for him, Anakin ends up getting limbs chopped off because Obi-Wan Kenobi had the high ground and doesn't end up being as strong and young of a body that Palpatine can run into. Now he's stuck with Vader until Luke Skywalker comes along. Now there's an opportunity for him to get rid of Vader. He's got a young body, and now he can move forward. And again, this is how he ends up trying to cheat death. Unfortunately, Vader goes and throws him down the shaft, which forces Palpatine to have to do what? To save himself by putting his consciousness into an object instead, in hopes of eventually coming back, which he ends up doing, potentially in Snoke. But then Snoke gets cut down, so what does he do? He jumps back into the MacGuffin again. And that's where he is until he possesses Matt Smith. Matt Smith has Palpatine's consciousness. The MacGuffin is the only way that he can save himself unless he jumps into somebody else. They destroy the MacGuffin. Now Palpatine is vulnerable. When Matt Smith is taken out, he jumps into Kylo Ren. The only way to get rid of him fully is to kill Kylo Ren at the hands of Rey, which ultimately destroys Palpatine, but frees Kylo from the bondage, and Ben Solo is thusly saved. That is my complete and total speculation. I think it would be cool. I am totally fine with whatever J.J. Abrams does, though. What do you think about all of this? Really looking forward to your listener feedback. talkshownerd@gmail.com. As always, you can also leave a comment on YouTube as well. Let me know what you think, and we will get into it on next week's show. I really, really can't wait to find out what your thoughts are on this. Again, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Also, you can leave a comment on YouTube as well, and you know, find me on. I have messages open on my Twitter feeds too. I'll have a little bit more information on this at the end of the show, but I just did a massive update at mynerdworld.net, so if you want to get caught up on any of the episodes, that's the place where you can go. Makes it real easy. Just go to the Star Wars Podcast, a Star Wars Podcast page there. Also, I put up a bunch of concept art for the cover art for Embark. There's a lot of specific pieces of art that were commissioned to create the covers for both the first book and for Embark, Treasure in Darkness. And like I mentioned earlier in the show, I've discounted the book this week, and I'll give you details here in just a moment. But let's dive into listener feedback this week. I got a couple of emails that I want to share with you, and we'll save the rest for next week's show since we're going super long for this May the 4th spoiler spectacular.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
Jin writes this great podcast. Totally agree that Han went out on that walkway and either assisted Kylo or gave him a tacit approval to kill him in an effort to ease Kylo/Ben's confliction. Hence, both their hands being on the saber and Kylo saying thank you. He knew Han was sacrificing himself. It was immediately obvious that it didn't work and that Kylo remained conflicted, and increasingly so. That touch that Han gave Ben as he died was done with love. Thank you so much for the comment, Jin. Those are some great thoughts. The helmet, says Tracy, is really throwing me off because I always assumed he would start with it and then lose it later on. However, the trailer scenes and the images they have shown during Celebration of Kylo are mainly of him without his mask. And yet, if he's getting it made during the movie, then that means he didn't have it for a year and probably not for his initial meeting with Rey. I'm very curious which act the trailer scenes are coming from during the movie. Are they all from Act 1 or later? Does he have his helmet at the beginning or not? Does he lose it later or go back and forth with wearing it? For those that stayed through the massive potential end of the Rise of Skywalker, I'm going to present this without getting into spoilers, so don't worry if you avoided that part. Maybe Kylo's not wearing it. And other people have speculated this as well. Maybe it's not Kylo wearing the mask. And maybe what we saw in the trailer, especially with the shot, because we know a Knight of Ren is there, is actually the Knights of Ren reforging it for somebody else. That has the potential too. All right, let's go to SJ's. Got a couple of emails from SJ's this week. Couple of thoughts. The helmet being pieced back together would be hugely symbolic in Ben's final chapter. Leia will give the medal shown in the trailer to Chewie when saying goodbye. I believe Ben will insist Rey must strike him down, but in a sacrificial way, and all that remains is Ben Solo. Great points, SJ, especially... well, I'm not going to say that because I don't want to ruin anything for people that didn't listen to the leaking part of it. The Leia, Metal, and Chewie thing, I absolutely like. That's one where I could totally see happening, especially because it's been kind of a running joke that Chewie never got a medal after the Death Star battle in A New Hope, and they have footage of her holding the lightsaber, which they could have switched it for. And JJ was very disappointed in how he handled Chewie and Leia when they returned back to Octo at the end of The Force Awakens. So that makes a lot of sense in my book. SJ's goes on to say, I truly think we will get a scene with Ben, his Excalibur from the stone moment. Unworthy in 7, ties Rey in 8, does something in 9 to make the saber call to him now, and uses it to protect Rey or turn the tide of the battle, and that the scene is so epic it can only be described as the Sharon Stone the Sharon Stone basic instinct scene mixed in with the opening to Casino Royale. Sorry, I was thinking Lord of the Rings there for a moment. The Raid Redemption, the entirety of Alien, Shawshank Redemption, and the gates of heaven with Jesus himself saying, "Welcome, man, the dude abides." And we leave the cleanup crew to the theater with disgusting detached jaws lying on the floor like some sort of horrible, horrible thing happened. But we know the truth. The scene is worthy of losing your lower jaw over. Ha ha, love you, man. SJ's, that was fantastic. I butchered it, but man, that was great. All right, let's get to Baffled and Deranged. Said this, I couldn't resist the Force any longer. I went to Amazon and bought your first book. Thank you, Baffled, for doing that. You can pick it up right now for this weekend. The ebook for just 99 cents, and the paperback is at its lowest price ever. I'll have further details on this coming up in just a moment. But thank you so much for purchasing my book, Baffled. I really appreciate it. Black-Eyed Lily writes this, great show this week. As for possible leaks, I'm particularly excited about the idea of Han somehow visiting his son in a show of understanding and forgiveness. I think this is important not only for the story, but also to help fans who feel Han's murder ruled out any hope of redemption for Ben. If his father understands and forgives, that everyone else should be able to as well. They made Han's feelings clear about this at the time of his death in the novelization, but the casual fans don't access the supplementary materials need to get this too. I also like the hints of Kylo's death and resurrection. It continues the Beauty and the Beast theme that they started with, and the sacrificial death for the greater good should get any remaining skeptics behind Ben-demption. I too look forward to the promotional period of these upcoming months, but I have to end with, you don't like the Beatles? Blasphemy. I'm just not, look, the Beatles are great, they're just not my cup of tea. I'm a Depeche Mode guy through and through. The only band from that era that I really kind of get into is like Steely Dan, right? Some Beatles stuff is good. They're just not my cup of tea. That's all. I was born and raised in Southern California and weaned on K-rock, alternative rock. That's my alternative rock Manchester bands. That was my Depeche Mode, the Jesus Jones, EMF, Happy Mondays. The list goes on and on. Anyway, okay. Roxalina Jen says this, another rad podcast, John. Thank you, Roxalina. Your name is rad. Roxalina's totally rad. Wow. Looking forward to Reylo and Bendemption and agree with the idea that Skywalker becomes the new term for a Force user. Interesting. Regarding the Knights of Ren, if they're returning under the influence of Palpatine, could they be initiating the repair of the helmet to facilitate Palp's control over Kylo? Snoke created the bridge between Kylo and Rey, but perhaps under Palpatine's direction. Love all the discussion and speculation. Thank you, Roxalina. I appreciate that. Friend of the show, longtime listener, Miss Suki777. Hi, John. What are your thoughts on Rey and Kylo's fight? Is it going to be right at the end or halfway through? Personally, I'm hoping it isn't right at the end, as it means that Rey and Kylo could be enemies throughout the film. And do you have an opinion on the Vader Dark Shadows comic, issue 3 that people are talking about? Don't have an opinion on that. They wrap up with a great show as always. Yeah, the Kylo, Rey, and Ren fight, I'm actually getting to the point now where I think it happens a lot earlier in the film. I think they end up confronting each other earlier in the film, and they're split apart. And then the next time they rejoin, they reconcile, and then we head towards the end of the movie. But again, all that could change. Let's see. Andrea F. writes this. When you were talking about Kylo being potentially killed and resurrected, I had a thought. What if they trade a life for a life? As heartbreaking as it sounds, what if Leia gives her life in exchange for her son's life? Yeah, interesting. I don't think they're going to kill off Leia in this film, though. I think she makes it to the end. My opinion. We'll see. Thank you for the comment, though. Globe-trotting Tiffers. So the whole retconning of what Rian Johnson did in The Last Jedi is so ridiculous. Ugh, I'm so over it. JJ was part of the production for The Last Jedi, and it wouldn't make any sense or do any favors for 9 to erase or fix what happened in 8. I think it would be confusing and take away from the progress the characters have made. 8 added so much emotional depth to the characters and set up 9 beautifully to finish off the saga. I absolutely agree. All right, and last one for this week, I believe. Yes, last one for this week. There's a lengthy one from a new listener, but I want to be able to spend a lot of time on it, and the show's gone long this week. And I just got the email yesterday, so I'll save that one for next week. But friend of the show, Anthea Gaia says this. Your discussion of Kylo's helmet and possibly some kind of ritual with it made me think, or maybe the Knights of Ren will try to bring Palpatine back using Kylo's helmet. Yeah, a lot of people are heading this way. Could the helmet be a Horcrux, mentioned that earlier, of sorts, where Palpatine's spirit gets attached to it and then possesses Kylo when he puts the helmet on? Could his knights potentially turn on him and bring Palpatine back in Ben's body? All really good speculation. Thank you so much, Anthea. I appreciate that. And thank you to all of you who have written in. talkshownerd@gmail.com is where you can email me. Of course, leave a comment on YouTube as well. All right, so 2 quick things before I wrap things up. Okay. First off, I have a question for you, and respond to me however you like. Email, YouTube, whatever. I am considering doing the podcast exactly the same way I do it, but changing the YouTube portion to make it live. It would require a bit of effort on my part to pull it off. It would be basically me. I do the show completely live. Today I did a little bit of stopping and starting and some editing because of the big leaks portion that we talked about. But for the most part, I treat the show every week like I treat my weekly radio show, where I just do it all beginning to end live, and I have my production studio set up in front of me to where I just hit everything live. That's what I've been doing for 24 years, and it's what serves me best, is to just do the show as if I was doing it live. So my question to you is, would you rather me continue to do it this way? For those of you that watch on or listen to it through YouTube, would you like to see a live version of it? That's a simple question. It would basically be a live version of what I do now. Might be a little wonky because I don't know if I can patch in all the sound effects. I'll try to figure that out. But if you listen on YouTube Do you prefer me doing it this way, or for the YouTube version, would you prefer to have a live version where you can see my big old fat face talking to you every single week? Leave me a comment, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or drop a comment on YouTube, and we'll go from there. And I'll decide whether or not... I've toyed with the idea in the past, but when it comes to growing the show, I'm just wondering if whether or not you would you would like it better if I did the show via video, along with all the other ways of listening to it as well. And lastly, as always, if you want to support the show when I don't have regular advertisers on here, which right now I don't, the best way that you can go and show your support for My Nerd World and the Star Wars podcast is by purchasing a copy of my science fiction space opera novel, Embark. Book 1 in the Embark trilogy series, written by me, Jon Justice. Get a copy for yourself or for a friend. That's for everybody that's purchased it already. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. For those that haven't, if you want to show your support for the show, pick up a copy of the book. Here's the deal. In the near future, flight culture is replaced by air and space flight. It is the end of the world, and for ruthless corporate madman Sin Argam, that's a good thing. For the reluctant hero, mechanic Taft Guardia, and the girl he loves, Kaith Amaro, it's up to them and their friends to save what's left. This is an epic adventure that I wrote because of my love of Star Wars and my desire to create my own characters and my own universe based off of all the stories that I love within science fiction and storytelling in and of itself. It's an all-original tale. I like to believe that it has an essence of Star Wars, but it is not Star Wars. It's a completely brand new series. The second book, Embark, Treasure in Darkness Book 2, will be out in the next few months. Right now, if you go to Amazon.com, it's free on Kindle Unlimited. So get me some Kindle reads, mark the book to read, and share it with friends. The ebook right now is just 99 cents. If you've already picked up a copy of it, go and you can gift it to a friend. You got a friend who's a sci-fi fan, a Star Wars fan, and they're readers. It's a fantastic holdover while we wait for more information about the Rise of Skywalker and all the new Star Wars information coming out. So go on to Amazon.com and search for Embark. Get a copy for yourself or a friend. The paperback right now is the cheapest that I can make it at $11.99. Purchase of the paperback gets you a free copy of the ebook with every single paperback purchase. The audiobook is free with an Audible trial. If you purchase the ebook for 99 cents, you can actually pick up the audiobook at a quarter of the price. Like the regular price for the audiobook is like $24. You can pick up a copy of the audiobook for $7.49, basically $7.50. So you can get the ebook and the audiobook, which is produced by me and narrated by me. It's 11 and a half hours long. You can purchase the ebook and the audiobook for just $8.50. Get them both together. You can go to mynerdworld.net, hit the link there to buy the book. You can see all the links there, or just go to Amazon.com and pick the version that you want to pick. If you've read the book already and you want to support the show, again, supporting my efforts as an author, if you haven't left a positive review yet, please go and do so. That really helps me out a ton. If you've read Embark and you enjoyed it, positive reviews, please. You can go on to Amazon.com and leave a positive review of the book. That would really, really help me out if you've already purchased the book. And if you haven't purchased the book yet, then stop what you're doing. Go to Amazon.com, look for Jon, Jon Justice, and Embark. If it's not for you, then for a friend or a family member, it would just mean the world to me. It means the world to me that you guys download the show every single week. Thank you so much. And again, it's only because of you listening that the show has grown the way that it has. This week was a really cool week. I met a lot of new podcasters via Twitter, made a lot of new followers, and I love the Star Wars fandom. So help me celebrate. Help me help you celebrate May the 4th be with you in Star Wars Day, and support the podcast by going to Amazon.com and picking up whatever version of my science fiction space opera epic Embark novel that you like. I would really, really appreciate it. So May the 4th be with you. Peter Mayhew, thank you so much. You will absolutely be missed. I'm going to go watch some Star Wars today and remember all the joy that you provided for so many of us. You're really, really going to be missed. Thank you so much for checking out the show again this week. We'll be back again next week, and I can't wait to hear from you with all the listener feedback. All right? So I guess that's it. Happy May the 4th. And may the Force be with you. Here's Obi-Wan Kenobi to take us out and say pretty much the same thing. Bye.
The Force will be with you. Always.
My nerd world.
There has been an awakening. Have you felt it?